They came ashore believing they would sweep aside cowards who had never tasted real war. Within 72 hours, the jungle would run red with their blood, their bodies stacked like cordwood along a narrow sandbar where the ocean met the trees. What happened on Guadalcanal in the second half of 1942 was not just a battle. It was the moment an empire discovered that faith in superiority cannot stop bullets, that spiritual strength cannot defeat industrial might, and that no amount of courage can compensate for empty stomachs and ammunition crates filled with nothing but tropical air. This is the story of how a remote island in the Solomon Chain became a graveyard for Japanese ambitions, and how the United States Marine Corps transformed jungle warfare into a mechanized slaughter that would echo across the entire Pacific theater until the final days of the war. The island itself seemed designed to punish human ambition. Guadalcanal stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, a spine of volcanic mountains draped in rainforest so thick that men could stand 10 feet apart and never see each other. The heat did not merely oppress. It extracted moisture from human bodies like a patient torturer, leaving Marines and Japanese soldiers alike stumbling through fever dreams, where the boundary between waking and delirium dissolved into the perpetual green twilight beneath the canopy. Rivers that appeared as gentle blue lines on maps revealed themselves as malarial death traps, their banks churning with crocodiles that had learned to distinguish the living from the dead. The Japanese had chosen this hellscape for an airfield because geography is destiny in naval warfare, and whoever controlled the skies above Guadalcanal controlled the sea lanes connecting Australia to the United States, the arteries through which flowed every ounce of fuel, every bullet, every hope of Allied victory in the Pacific. The airfield was nearly complete when the first waves of United States Marines stormed ashore on the 7th of August, 1942. Japanese construction crews, startled from their breakfast of rice and fish, fled into the jungle, leaving behind equipment still warm from use, plans still spread across makeshift tables, and a nearly operational runway that would within hours become the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific. The Marines renamed it Henderson Field after a pilot killed at Midway, transforming a symbol of Japanese expansion into an American fortress almost before Tokyo understood what had occurred. They dug in with the manic energy of men who knew the counterattack would come, and when it came, it would be merciless. But the Japanese Navy struck first, and they struck with devastating precision. At Savo Island, just north of Guadalcanal, Japanese cruisers materialized out of the tropical night like avenging spirits, their searchlights suddenly blazing across unprepared American and Australian warships. The sea erupted in fire. Ships that had carried the Marines to their landing now burned and sank, taking more than 1,000 sailors down into water so deep their bodies would never be recovered. The Japanese withdrew before dawn, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal isolated, undersupplied, and staring at the horizon wondering if anyone was coming back for them. The naval victory at Savo Island should have been the prelude to annihilation. It should have allowed Japanese forces to land overwhelming reinforcements and crush the Marine beachhead before it hardened into something defensible. But the Japanese Navy sailed away instead of finishing what it had started, and that hesitation would prove catastrophic. The Marines understood with crystal clarity what the generals and admirals sometimes forgot. Henderson Field was not merely a strategic position or a symbolic objective. It was the hinge upon which the entire campaign would turn. If the airfield remained operational, American planes could dominate the surrounding waters during daylight, forcing Japanese resupply efforts into desperate night runs. If the Japanese recaptured it, The Marines would wither under aerial bombardment until their position became untenable and the island reverted to Tokyo's control. Everything else was commentary. Every patrol into the jungle, every ton of supplies ferried ashore, every defensive position scraped from the coral soil served a single purpose: keeping Henderson Field in American hands. Colonel Ichiki arrived with his detachment, convinced that the Americans clinging to Henderson Field were a disorganized rabble, demoralized by their naval losses, and ready to collapse under a bold assault. Japanese intelligence had been catastrophically wrong about American intentions and capabilities since before Pearl Harbor, but Ichiki embodied a particularly toxic strain of this delusion. He had fought in China, where poorly equipped Chinese forces had often broken under aggressive Japanese attacks. He had internalized the propaganda about American softness, about their unwillingness to accept casualties, about their dependence on material comfort that would evaporate in the harsh crucible of jungle warfare. He was a professional officer, a veteran, a man who had led soldiers into combat and emerged victorious. But he had never faced an enemy like the United States Marine Corps, and his understanding of modern warfare had not evolved beyond the tactics that had succeeded against opponents who lacked industrial logistics and combined arms coordination. The Marines who waited in their defensive positions along the Tenaru River possessed none of Ichiki's confidence, but they held something far more valuable: preparation, firepower, and the cold professional understanding that wars are won not by courage alone, but by the efficient application of violence. They had strung barbed wire in overlapping belts designed to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. They had positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire where every square foot of ground could be swept with lead. They had registered artillery coordinates, pre-positioned ammunition, and constructed fortified positions that offered protection while maintaining clear lines of sight. When Ichiki's scouts probed the American defenses, they reported back that the Marines appeared alert and well-armed, but Ichiki dismissed these warnings as timidity. His orders from higher command urged caution, advised waiting for reinforcements, counseled patience. He ignored them. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki launched his assault across the sandbar, where the Tenaru River met the ocean, a narrow strip of open ground that funneled his troops directly into the muzzles of Marine weapons. The Japanese came with bayonets fixed, screaming, convinced that shock and determination would overwhelm the defenders. For approximately 90 seconds, the Marines held fire, allowing the attackers to commit fully to their assault, to mass on the sandbar where retreat would be almost impossible. Then the machine guns opened up, and the night transformed into a vision of industrial slaughter that would have been unimaginable to soldiers from any previous war. The sustained, overlapping fire was not the ragged crackle of individual riflemen, but the continuous roar of mechanized death, bullets arriving in such quantity that the human body became simply a target that would stop moving once enough metal passed through it. Japanese soldiers fell in rows, in stacks, in piles that formed new obstacles for those behind them, who continued the attack not from bravery, but because turning back meant running into their own comrades still surging forward. The Marines fed belt after belt into machine guns that had been positioned specifically for this moment, their barrels glowing red in the darkness, their crews working with the efficient choreography of men who had trained until the movements became automatic. Artillery rounds began falling among the Japanese rear elements, not random impacts but precisely targeted explosions designed to prevent reinforcement and cut off withdrawal. The attack shattered against the Marine defenses like a wave against concrete, except the wave was made of human flesh, and the concrete replied with bullets. Those Japanese soldiers who survived the initial slaughter found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making, pinned down on a narrow beach with the ocean on one side, impenetrable defenses on the other, and daylight approaching. When the sun rose, it revealed a scene that shocked even combat-hardened Marines. Bodies lay so thick in places that the sand was no longer visible. The wounded who could not retreat had committed suicide rather than face capture, following a military code that viewed surrender as a fate worse than death. Ichiki himself, having witnessed the annihilation of his command, burned his regimental colors and shot himself rather than report the disaster to his superiors. But the Marines were not content to simply repel the attack. They had learned in training and in early combat that allowing a defeated enemy to withdraw and regroup was an invitation to face them again under potentially worse circumstances. A battalion swung around the Japanese flank while light tanks, their treads churning through sand and undergrowth, advanced directly into what remained of Ichiki's force. The counterattack was not warfare as the Japanese had understood it. It was mechanical extermination. Tanks rolled over foxholes, crushing men who had nowhere to retreat. Marines with flamethrowers burned out pockets of resistance, the screams of burning men echoing across the battlefield, as a reminder that modern war had evolved into something that made medieval sieges look humane by comparison. When the action concluded, approximately 900 of Ichiki's original force of roughly 950 men were dead. American casualties numbered in the dozens. The magnitude of the disaster sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. An entire regiment, led by an experienced officer, had been effectively erased from existence in a single night. The carefully cultivated myth of Japanese martial superiority, of spiritual strength overcoming material disadvantage, had collided with the brutal reality of American industrial warfare and shattered into fragments. But instead of prompting a fundamental reassessment of strategy, the defeat only hardened Japanese determination to recapture the island through sheer persistence, throwing more troops into the same jungle that had already consumed Ichiki's command. The Tokyo Express became the lifeline that sustained Japanese efforts on Guadalcanal, a desperate improvisation born from the fact that conventional resupply during daylight hours meant sailing into the range of American aircraft based at Henderson Field. Japanese destroyers, stripped of unnecessary equipment to maximize speed and cargo capacity, raced down the channel between the islands in darkness, unloaded whatever troops and supplies they could during the brief hours before dawn, then withdrew at maximum speed before American planes could catch them. The system succeeded in moving soldiers to Guadalcanal, but it failed catastrophically at delivering the heavy equipment, abundant food supplies, medical resources, and ammunition, reserves necessary to sustain a military campaign in hostile territory. Troops arrived on the island with light weapons and perhaps a week of rations, then found themselves trapped in a jungle that offered nothing edible, surrounded by an enemy that controlled the only viable supply route during daylight, slowly starving while trying to fight a war. Japanese commanders continued planning offensives as if adequate logistics were simply a matter of willpower, as if determination could substitute for the trucks, the fuel, the field kitchens, the ammunition dumps, and the medical stations that allowed the Marines to maintain combat effectiveness despite operating in the same brutal environment. The Japanese army had never developed a sophisticated logistics system because their previous campaigns in Asia had relied on living off conquered territories or operating from well-established bases in controlled territory. Guadalcanal offered neither option. The jungle gave nothing but disease and death. The American perimeter was impenetrable, and the longer Japanese forces remained on the island, the weaker they became. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi arrived in early September with reinforcements and orders to capture Henderson Field. But the plan that looked coherent on maps in Rabaul dissolved into chaos when executed in the trackless jungle of Guadalcanal. Moving thousands of troops through terrain where even small units struggled required perfect coordination, reliable communications, and enough food to sustain soldiers during days of approach marches. The Japanese had none of these advantages, but Kawaguchi attacked anyway, focusing his main effort on a ridge south of the airfield, where the Marines had established defensive positions under the command of Colonel Edson. Edson's ridge became the site of the most desperate fighting since the initial landing. 2 nights of sustained assault where Japanese infantry attacked again and again, convinced that one more push would break through, that American defenders would crack under pressure and abandon their positions. The Marines gave ground slowly, withdrawing to secondary positions when their forward lines became untenable, but they never broke. Artillery fire directed by forward observers turned the jungle approaches into kill zones. Marine raiders and paratroopers, elite units trained specifically for this kind of desperate defensive action, poured rifle fire into attacking forces that became visible only when they were close enough to be targets. Grenades and mortar rounds exploded among Japanese formations, trying to maneuver in darkness through terrain they barely understood. When dawn broke after the second night, the ground in front of Marine positions was carpeted with Japanese dead, their bodies testimony to courage that had been wasted in attacks against prepared defenses supported by overwhelming firepower. Kawaguchi's offensive had failed as completely as Ichiki's, though at least Kawaguchi survived to report his defeat. The Japanese had committed approximately 6,000 troops to the attack and suffered casualties approaching 40%. Marine losses, while significant, were a fraction of the Japanese total, a ratio that reflected the fundamental arithmetic of modern warfare. Defenders in prepared positions supported by artillery and machine guns will nearly always inflict disproportionate casualties on attackers who lack the firepower to suppress defensive positions before assault. But the true killer on Guadalcanal was not bullets or bombs. It was the island itself, the relentless combination of disease, malnutrition, and environmental stress that transformed healthy soldiers into shambling skeletons in a matter of weeks. Malaria swept through Japanese encampments like wildfire, the mosquitoes transmitting parasites that induced fever, delirium, and progressive weakness. Dysentery turned the simple act of eating into a gamble that often resulted in debilitating intestinal distress. Tropical ulcers, minor cuts that refused to heal in the humid environment, expanded into suppurating wounds that could cripple a man as effectively as a bullet. Japanese soldiers, already operating on starvation rations, found their bodies consuming muscle tissue to maintain basic functions. Men who had arrived on the island as fit infantrymen became unable to march, unable to carry equipment, barely able to stand upright. The Marines suffered from the same environmental conditions, but American logistics meant they received adequate food, water purification supplies, quinine for malaria suppression, and medical evacuation for serious cases. Marines rotated off the island for rest when possible. They received mail from home, small reminders that they remained connected to a world beyond this jungle nightmare. Japanese soldiers received nothing but orders to attack and vague promises that reinforcements were coming. They watched their comrades die not from heroic combat but from preventable diseases and simple starvation, and they understood with growing clarity that they had been abandoned to a fate their commanders refused to acknowledge. Throughout late 1942, the Japanese Navy made repeated attempts to neutralize Henderson Field through naval bombardment, landing additional troops, and engaging the American fleet in surface actions that ranged across the waters surrounding Guadalcanal. The naval battles were vicious, confused nighttime engagements where ships blundered into each other at close range and settled their differences with point-blank gunfire and torpedoes. Both sides lost warships, both sides claimed tactical victories, but the strategic outcome remained unchanged. Henderson Field stayed operational. American aircraft continued dominating the surrounding waters during daylight, and Japanese forces on the island continued their slow collapse. In late October, the Japanese launched their largest offensive yet, a coordinated assault involving simultaneous attacks from multiple directions designed to overwhelm marine defenses through sheer weight of numbers. The plan required precise timing, effective communication between separated units, and troops healthy enough to execute complex maneuvers after days of movement through the jungle. The Japanese achieved none of these prerequisites, but they attacked anyway because orders from higher command demanded action, regardless of objective circumstances. Assaults began at different times, arrived from unexpected directions, and dissolved into confused melees where Japanese units sometimes fired on each other in the darkness. Marines, fighting from established positions with clear fields of fire and abundant ammunition, repelled each attack with the same methodical application of firepower that had characterized previous engagements. When the offensive finally exhausted itself, Japanese casualties were catastrophic, losses so severe that the formations involved ceased to exist as effective military units. Survivors retreated into the jungle, many too weak to carry their weapons, their uniforms rotting off their bodies, their skin stretched tight over bones. They had fought with suicidal courage and achieved nothing except their own destruction. The marine perimeter remained intact. Henderson Field continued operations, and the fundamental equation of the campaign remained unchanged. The side with functioning logistics would win, and the side starving in the jungle would eventually have to evacuate or die in place. Japanese commanders in Rabaul continued drafting plans for renewed offensives throughout late 1942 and into early 1943. But the gap between these plans and battlefield reality grew so vast that even the most optimistic officers began questioning whether Guadalcanal could be held. Intelligence reports from the island painted a picture of complete collapse. Formations existed on paper but consisted of men too weak to fight, equipment that had rusted into uselessness, and ammunition reserves measured in rounds per soldier rather than cases per unit. Reinforcements sent to the island simply joined the slow death march, adding more mouths to feed from non-existent supplies while contributing little combat power. The decision to evacuate came not from a sudden strategic insight, but from the gradual accumulation of evidence that no amount of courage or determination could overcome logistical impossibility. In early February 1943, Japanese destroyers returned to Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, but this time they came to extract rather than deliver. The evacuation was executed with the same skill the Japanese Navy had demonstrated throughout the campaign, ships appearing and disappearing with minimal losses, but what they carried away bore little resemblance to the confident troops who had arrived months earlier. The soldiers who stumbled aboard evacuation vessels were hollow-eyed ghosts, their uniforms hanging from skeletal frames, many unable to walk without assistance. Some were so weak they had to be carried by comrades barely stronger. These were not defeated soldiers in the conventional sense. They were survivors of a catastrophe that had consumed entire formations. The final accounting was staggering. Japan had committed approximately 36,000 troops to Guadalcanal and lost approximately 25,000, casualties approaching 70%. Disease and starvation had killed more Japanese soldiers than American bullets. The survivors evacuated from the island were so physically destroyed that many never returned to combat duty, their bodies too damaged to recover fully even with adequate medical care and nutrition. The campaign had consumed 3 entire infantry divisions, units that represented years of training and combat experience, irreplaceable losses for an empire that had begun the war with limited industrial capacity and a population smaller than its primary enemies. American casualties totaled around 7,000, losses that were grievous but sustainable for a nation with vast industrial resources and a population willing to accept significant sacrifice to win the war. More importantly, the Marines who fought on Guadalcanal had learned lessons about jungle warfare, combined arms coordination, and the importance of logistics that would inform every subsequent campaign in the Pacific. They had discovered that Japanese soldiers, while often suicidally brave, were not supernatural warriors immune to bullets and shells. They had proven that American troops, properly supplied and supported, could endure tropical conditions and emerge victorious against an enemy that had been conquering territory across Asia for years. The strategic implications rippled across the Pacific theater and beyond. Guadalcanal demonstrated that Japan's defensive perimeter was vulnerable, that amphibious assaults could succeed against prepared positions if executed with adequate resources and determination. It proved that American industrial might could project power across vast oceanic distances and sustain military operations in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. It shattered the psychological advantage Japan had gained in the war's early months, when lightning victories and minimal Allied resistance had created an illusion of invincibility. After Guadalcanal, everyone understood that Japan could be beaten, that the path to victory would be long and bloody but ultimately achievable. For the Japanese military, Guadalcanal revealed catastrophic weaknesses in their entire approach to modern warfare. The focus on offensive spirit and individual courage, while producing soldiers willing to die for their emperor, could not compensate for systemic failures in logistics, coordination, and combined arms doctrine. The myth that superior morale could overcome material disadvantage died in the jungles of Guadalcanal, alongside thousands of soldiers who had believed in that myth, until the moment they starved to death or died from preventable disease. Japanese commanders had treated logistics as a secondary concern, something that would work itself out through improvisation and willpower, and that assumption had resulted in catastrophe. The campaign demonstrated that modern industrial warfare operates according to brutal arithmetic that does not care about courage or honor or fighting spirit. Soldiers need ammunition to fight, food to maintain strength, medical supplies to treat wounds and disease, and reliable supply lines to deliver these essentials. Vehicles need fuel and spare parts. Artillery needs shells. Communications require functioning equipment. None of these requirements can be wished away through determination or compensated for through suicidal bravery. An army that cannot feed itself will lose regardless of how courageously its soldiers fight, a lesson the Japanese military proved again and again throughout the Pacific War, but never seemed to fully internalize. The jungle itself became a weapon in American hands, not because Marines were more resistant to disease or better adapted to tropical conditions, but because American logistics mitigated environmental hazards that destroyed Japanese forces. Water purification tablets prevented dysentery. Quinine suppressed malaria. Adequate nutrition maintained immune systems capable of fighting off infections. Medical evacuation meant serious illnesses received treatment before becoming fatal. These were not dramatic advantages. They were boring, procedural, logistical advantages that happened to mean the difference between maintaining an effective fighting force and watching your army dissolve into a collection of dying men. Henderson Field, the piece of ground that had prompted the entire campaign, remained operational throughout the battle and became the foundation for American air superiority across the Solomon Islands. Planes based there sank Japanese supply ships, shot down bombers attempting to attack Allied positions, and provided reconnaissance that allowed the United States Navy to intercept Japanese fleet movements. The airfield's continued operation cascaded into strategic advantages that extended far beyond Guadalcanal itself, confirming what the Marines had understood from the beginning. Losing Henderson Field meant losing the entire campaign, and therefore the airfield had to be held regardless of cost. The soldiers who fought on Guadalcanal, both American and Japanese, experienced a kind of warfare that seemed designed to break human beings physically, mentally, and spiritually. The heat, the disease, the constant threat of sudden death, the knowledge that rescue might never come, the sight of comrades dying from wounds or illness or simple exhaustion all combined into a trauma that many carried for the rest of their lives. But the Marines had rotations, mail, medical care, and the knowledge that their suffering served a purpose within a larger strategy that was actually working. Japanese soldiers had none of these consolations. They died in a jungle far from home, fighting for an objective their commanders had already abandoned, starving because their logistical system had collapsed, sacrificed to a strategy that had been revealed as bankrupt but continued, because no one in authority would acknowledge reality. The lessons of Guadalcanal influenced every subsequent American operation in the Pacific. Amphibious assault techniques were refined, logistics networks were strengthened, combined arms coordination improved, intelligence gathering became more sophisticated. Each of these improvements built on foundations laid during the desperate months when the outcome remained uncertain and defeat was a constant possibility. The campaign transformed the United States Marine Corps from a force that specialized in small-scale interventions into an organization capable of projecting power across oceanic distances and sustaining combat operations in the most hostile environments imaginable. For Japan, Guadalcanal should have prompted fundamental reassessment of strategic assumptions, operational doctrine, and logistical capabilities. Instead, the military hierarchy largely blamed individual commanders for lack of fighting spirit, treated the defeat as an anomaly rather than a symptom of systemic problems, and continued prosecuting a war using methods that Guadalcanal had proven inadequate. The unwillingness to learn from catastrophic failure, to acknowledge that courage alone cannot overcome industrial and logistical superiority, condemned Japan to repeat similar disasters across the Pacific until the final surrender. The island itself returned to obscurity after the war, the jungle slowly reclaiming the battlefields where thousands had died. The rusting hulks of destroyed aircraft and abandoned equipment gradually disappeared beneath vegetation. The bones of soldiers who had died far from any marked grave became indistinguishable from the soil itself. But the lessons remained, inscribed in military doctrine, commemorated in unit histories, and remembered by the men who survived long enough to tell the story of how a remote island became the graveyard where Japanese ambitions in the Pacific died, alongside the myth of invincibility. What happened on Guadalcanal mattered not because it was the largest battle or the bloodiest or the most strategically significant in isolation, But because it was the first time in the Pacific War that American forces seized the initiative, held ground against repeated counterattacks, and forced Japan to acknowledge defeat. It established the template for island-hopping campaigns that would follow, demonstrating that amphibious assaults could succeed, that Japanese defensive positions could be overcome, and that American industrial might could be projected across vast distances to achieve strategic objectives. Every subsequent victory built on lessons learned in those desperate months when survival itself was uncertain. The soldiers who fought there understood they were participating in something larger than themselves, a campaign that would determine not just the fate of a single island, but the trajectory of the entire war. The Marines who held Henderson Field against impossible odds knew they were writing history, though few would have described it in such grandiose terms at the time. They were simply doing their jobs, following orders, trying to survive, and trusting that the sacrifices demanded of them served some larger purpose. The Japanese soldiers who died in the jungle believed the same thing, that their deaths mattered, that their sacrifice would contribute to eventual victory. The difference was that the Marines were right. So now you know what happened when Colonel Ichiki's detachment came ashore, believing they faced demoralized cowards who would flee at the first sign of determined assault. You know how the jungle became a graveyard, how industrial warfare revealed the bankruptcy of strategies based on spiritual superiority, and how logistics and material support decided the outcome more decisively than any amount of courage or determination. The campaign lasted 6 months. It consumed tens of thousands of lives. And when it ended, everyone understood that the war would continue until one side or the other achieved complete victory, because Guadalcanal had proven that half measures and negotiated settlements were impossible when the stakes were this absolute. If you found this story valuable, if it gave you insight into a campaign that changed the course of the Pacific War, consider subscribing to this channel so you never miss stories that bring history to life in ways textbooks cannot. Leave a like if this narrative resonated with you. And here is the question I want you to consider. Knowing what you now know about the logistics failures that doomed Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, do you believe any amount of courage or tactical brilliance could have changed the outcome? Or was the campaign decided before the first shot was fired by the industrial and logistical advantages that America possessed and Japan could never overcome? Share your thoughts in the comments below.